I never imagined I'd end up working at a morgue during my college years. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, and this one came right out of left field. It all started with the mounting pressure of rent and bills piling up. I was drowning in student loan debt, barely scraping by on a diet of ramen noodles and dollar store snacks. When I saw the job posting for a night guard at the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, it seemed like a godsend. The pay was decent, and I figured it would be a quiet gig where I could catch up on studying between rounds. Little did I know what I was getting myself into. The cemetery itself was ancient, dating back to the early 1800s. Sprawling over several acres, it was a maze of crumbling headstones, overgrown paths, and gnarled old trees that cast eerie shadows in the moonlight. The morgue was tucked away in a corner of the property, a squat, windowless building that looked like it had been there just as long as the oldest graves. My first night on the job was uneventful, but unsettling. I'd arrived just before sunset, the fading light casting long shadows across the tombstones. The day staff gave me a quick tour, showing me the security office, the cold storage units, and the main examination room. The smell hit me first, a sickly sweet odor of disinfectant barely masking the underlying scent of death. I tried not to look too closely at the sheet-covered forms on the stretchers as we passed through. The security office was small and cluttered, with ancient monitors lining one wall. The cameras were outdated, producing grainy black and white images, but they covered all the essential areas. My job was simple: monitor the cameras, make hourly rounds, and report any suspicious activity. Easy enough, I thought. As night fell, an eerie quiet settled over the cemetery. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the constant low hum of the cold storage units. I busied myself with textbooks, glancing up at the monitors every few minutes. Every hour, I'd make my rounds, flashlight in hand, moving through the dimly lit halls past the cold storage units and into the main examination room. Those first few nights passed without incident. I'd arrive, check in, settle into my routine of study and surveillance. The quiet was oppressive at times, but I got used to it. I even started to find a certain peace in the solitude, away from the chaos of campus life. But about a week into the job, things took a turn for the bizarre. I was doing my usual camera check, eyes scanning over the grainy images, when something in the main exam room caught my attention. There were supposed to be 3 bodies on stretchers, covered with sheets, but I only counted 2. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Still just 2. My heart started racing, pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Had someone broken in and stolen a body? Was this some sick prank by local kids? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had miscounted earlier, or perhaps one body had been moved to cold storage. But I knew that wasn't the case. I had done my rounds just an hour ago, and all 3 were there. I grabbed my flashlight, its weight reassuring in my sweaty palm, and headed out to investigate. The halls seemed longer and darker than usual, every shadow making me jump. The beam of my flashlight danced erratically along the walls as I walked, my hand shaking slightly. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, echoing in the empty corridor. As I approached the exam room, a new sound reached my ears. Footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but definitely there. I froze, listening intently. They seemed to be coming from up ahead, but then I heard them behind me too. My skin crawled as I realized they seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I called out, asking if anyone was there, my voice cracking slightly. No response came, just more footsteps, growing neither louder nor softer, just persistently there. I gathered my courage and pushed open the door to the exam room, my flashlight beam darting wildly around the space. And there, on the 3rd stretcher, was the missing body. Right where it should have been all along. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sheet rose and fell slightly with each breath I took, the stark white fabric, a sharp contrast to the shadows around it. Had I simply missed it on the camera? Was I seeing things? I approached cautiously, half expecting the body to sit up at any moment. But it remained still, just like the others. I reached out a trembling hand and gently lifted the edge of the sheet. The face beneath was pale and waxy, eyes closed, unmistakably dead. I let the sheet fall back into place and quickly left the room, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallway. Back in the security office, I rewound the camera footage, searching for any sign of what had happened. But there was nothing unusual. No sign of the body disappearing or reappearing. Just static images of 3 covered forms on stretchers, unchanging through the night. I told myself I was just tired, that the late nights were getting to me. The human mind can play tricks, especially in a place like this. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense that I had glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. The next few nights, I was on high alert. I checked the cameras obsessively, made more frequent rounds. I started talking to myself just to break the oppressive silence. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch what looked like movement on one of the monitors. But when I looked directly at it, everything would be still. Then it happened again. This time, I was absolutely certain. 3 bodies when I started my shift, clearly visible on the cameras. I had even made a point of counting them out loud, reassuring myself. But an hour into my shift, as I glanced at the monitors, I saw only 2. The middle stretcher was empty, the sheet flat against its surface. My mouth went dry, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I knew I had to go check, but every fiber of my being screamed against it. I sat there for several minutes, trying to work up the courage. Finally, I stood up on shaky legs and grabbed my flashlight. The walk to the exam room felt like it took hours. Every step was an effort, my body fighting against my will to move forward. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. As I approached the room, I heard what sounded like labored breathing. It was raspy and irregular, the sound of someone struggling for air. I pushed open the door, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. 3 bodies, all in their proper places. But as I moved closer, I noticed something odd about the middle body. It was the man who had died of a heart attack I remembered from the intake forms. Middle-aged, slightly overweight, graying hair. The sheet covering him was slightly askew, as if he'd been moving beneath it. My hand trembled as I reached out to pull back the sheet. Every instinct told me to run, to leave this place and never come back. But I had to know. I pulled back the sheet, and my blood ran cold. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I knew for a fact his eyes had been closed earlier. I'd seen it on the intake form, had even noticed it during my earlier rounds. For a long moment, I stood there, staring at those lifeless eyes. They didn't blink, didn't move, but somehow I felt like they were looking right at me. I became aware of a high-pitched ringing in my ears, and my vision started to tunnel. I was on the verge of passing out. With a supreme effort of will, I tore my gaze away and ran. I didn't bother closing the door behind me, didn't look back. I ran through the halls, my footsteps echoing loudly, until I reached the security office. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. I wanted to leave right then, to run out into the night and never look back. But I couldn't afford to lose this job. Rent was due in a week, and I was already behind on my student loan payments. The thought of facing eviction or dropping out of school was almost as terrifying as what I'd just experienced. So I stayed. I forced myself to sit down at the desk to look at the monitors. Everything appeared normal now. 3 bodies, all covered, all still. But I couldn't shake the image of those open eyes from my mind. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. I didn't do any more rounds, couldn't bring myself to leave the relative safety of the office. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran to my car, the rising sun doing little to ease my fear. I thought about quitting, but the need for money won out over my terror. Night after night, I returned to that place of shadows and whispers. Sometimes things would be normal, and I'd start to convince myself that I had imagined it all. Other times, I'd see bodies move on the cameras, shifting positions ever so slightly. I'd hear footsteps, breathing, once even what sounded like quiet laughter. I started dreading my shifts, the fear building up hours before I had to leave for work. I lost weight, couldn't sleep during the day. My grades started slipping. But I kept going back, telling myself it was all in my head, that I just needed to tough it out until I could find a better job. One night, about a month into the job, things escalated to a point I never could have imagined. I was doing my usual camera check, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. The monitors flickered slightly, a common occurrence with the old equipment. But as the image stabilized, I saw something that made my blood run cold. All the bodies in the exam room were sitting up on their stretchers. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating. But when I looked again, the scene hadn't changed. 3 figures, sheets draped over their forms, sitting perfectly upright. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, they all turned their heads toward the camera, toward me. I wanted to run, to never look back. But some morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. The figures remained still for what felt like an eternity, their covered faces seeming to stare right through the camera. Then, slowly, they began to move. It wasn't the jerky, uncoordinated movement you'd expect from rigor mortis stiffened corpses. Their motions were fluid, almost graceful. They swung their legs over the sides of the stretchers, sheets still clinging to their forms. I should have run then. Should have bolted out the door and never looked back. But I was transfixed, unable to move, barely able to breathe. On the screen, the 3 figures stood up. For a moment, they simply stood there, swaying slightly. Then, as one, they turned toward the door. I watched in horror as they shuffled out of view of the camera. My mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the building. If they were leaving the exam room, where would they go? With a jolt of terror, I realized they could be heading for the security office. For me. That thought finally broke me out of my paralysis. I jumped up, knocking my chair over in the process. I ran to the door, fumbling with the lock with shaking hands. Just as I got it open, I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps, coming down the hall. Slow, shuffling steps, but steadily approaching. I slammed the door shut again, pressing my back against it. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The office had no windows, no other exits. I was trapped. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear a strange rustling sound accompanying them, like fabric dragging along the floor. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if by not seeing, I could make it all go away. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. I pressed against the door with all my strength, willing it to hold. The handle continued to turn, a slow, inexorable motion. I felt pressure against the door, something pushing from the other side. The hinges creaked ominously. Just when I thought the door would give way, everything stopped. The pressure disappeared. The handle slowly turned back. Then, more footsteps, this time moving away. I remained frozen in place, listening intently. The footsteps faded into the distance, accompanied by that strange rustling sound. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I heard a series of dull thuds. Then silence. I stayed there, back against the door, for the rest of my shift. I didn't look at the monitors again, couldn't bear to see what might be on them. When dawn finally came, I cautiously opened the door and peered out. The hallway was empty. Gathering every ounce of courage I had left, I made one final round. The exam room was quiet, all 3 bodies in place on their stretchers, sheets neatly arranged. There was no sign of disturbance, no indication of the nightmarish scene I had witnessed. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around, heart racing, but everything was still. Then I noticed something, a small detail that sent a chill down my spine. The sheet on one of the bodies was slightly askew, pulled down just enough to reveal a sliver of pale flesh and a closed eye. That was my breaking point. I finished my shift in a daze, handed in my resignation, and never went back. I told myself I'd find another way to make rent, even if it meant taking out more loans or asking my parents for help. No job was worth what I had experienced in that place. For weeks after, I had nightmares about the morgue. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear distant footsteps or see shadowy figures at the foot of my bed. I became jumpy, startling at the slightest unexpected sound. My friends noticed a change in me, asked if everything was okay. But how could I explain? Who would believe me? Gradually, the dreams faded, and I tried to put the whole experience behind me. I threw myself into my studies, picked up extra shifts at the campus coffee shop, did whatever I could to keep my mind occupied. Slowly, life began to return to normal. Years have passed since then. I graduated, got a normal job, started a family. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and shadows play on the walls, I still think about those strange occurrences at the morgue. Was it all in my head? Some sort of stress-induced hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and the unsettling environment? Or was there something more sinister at play in that old cemetery? Something that walks the line between life and death, toying with those unlucky enough to cross its path. I've researched the history of the place, looking for any clues, any similar stories. But if others have experienced what I did, they've kept it to themselves. I don't know if I'll ever have answers. But one thing's for sure, I'll never work another night shift again, especially not anywhere near a morgue. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. And some jobs, no matter how badly you need the money, just aren't worth the cost to your sanity. Sometimes, on dark nights when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering about that place. Is it still there, still operating? Has anyone else experienced what I did? Part of me wants to go back, to face my fears and find out the truth. But a larger part knows better. Whatever was happening in that morgue, whatever force was at work there, it's better left undisturbed. So I'll keep my memories to myself, a secret chapter in my life that no one else will ever know about. And if you ever find yourself desperate for work, considering a job that seems too good to be true, remember my story. Some places have secrets that are best left uncovered, and some experiences can change you in ways you never imagined. Be careful out there and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is.